It is my pleasure to welcome to the program today Dr. Peniel Joseph, who's the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin, also author of the book The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. So great to have you on.
Thank you for having me, David.
So to begin with, we've seen over the last 4 to 6 months some of the larger protests that this country has seen. I guess we can say in the sort of medium term since the Occupy Wall Street days of some years ago. And one of the great debates that has surfaced is in the context of the teachings of Malcolm X and the teachings of Martin Luther King. What would they say about the protests today? What would their views be about the tactics that would be considered either valid or moral or productive for achieving change today? And my instinct is that a lot of people are ascribing to these two men what they already believe to be the right answer. And so I want to start by going back to the history. How can we frame this conversation?
Well, I think the best way to frame it is to look at the convergences between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. So even though we think of Malcolm as the political sword of the 1960s, and we think of King as sort of this nonviolent human rights shield, one of the things I argue in my new book is that they really converge. Malcolm X is arguing for radical Black dignity. King is arguing for radical Black citizenship. And over time, they come to use that political sword and shield. Malcolm X goes from talking about self-defense and certainly this global revolution to saying that the civil rights movement should be a human rights movement. And he talks about the ballot or the bullet and actually using voting rights and using democratic institutions. But he always reserves the right of indigenous people for self-defense. King goes from talking about nonviolence, and he's always talking about no use of violence, but he starts to look at civil disobedience as a tool. He calls it a nonviolent political sword by 1965 that could paralyze cities in order to achieve racial justice and human rights for Black people, but for all people, right? So when we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, what that movement does is it uses both King's notion of radical Black citizenship and Malcolm X's notion of radical Black dignity. And when you think about what did Malcolm mean by that, he meant eradicating systemic racism and defeating white supremacy globally and allowing Black people to have political self-determination. King is going to say that citizenship is more than voting rights. It's actually a right to an income, a guaranteed job, affordable housing. King talks about food justice and, of course, dies trying to lead a poor people's campaign to occupy Washington, D.C., David. So you mentioned Occupy Wall Street, but King tried to occupy Washington, D.C. in 1968.
One of the things in the last 6 months, looking at interviews from decades ago, but with both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, one of the refrains that I frequently heard from Martin Luther King that I didn't find Malcolm X using, and I'm curious whether it is actually a distinction or maybe I didn't look hard enough, was Martin Luther King asserting that one of the risks sometimes of going over into violence is that it ends up disproportionately hurting the very people who these movements are actually trying to help. So sort of a two-part question. Is it true that that is a difference and that we did not hear that specific idea from Malcolm X? And is it accurate?
Well, I'd say that Malcolm talks about even Steven. He talks about an eye for an eye. I think when we think about Malcolm X, he talks about the Mau Mau, what happened in Kenya. He's really thinking about and supporting anti-colonial movements, anti-imperialist movements. He supports the Cuban Revolution. He supports the Algerian Revolution. He's supporting revolutions all over the place. So he's not saying exactly what King says there, where, look, if we were to achieve or try to enact guerrilla warfare, we're going to suffer the disproportionate losses, which I think King is correct in saying. I think Malcolm's more thinking about this global political revolution. And remember, Malcolm's alive during the age where Africa is decolonizing, where Latin America and the Caribbean and South America. This is, you think about from the 1940s all the way into the 80s and the 90s, the world is really on fire, right? The last African country is going to be South Africa with the freedom of Nelson Mandela. But when we think about Central America, Latin America, the Caribbean, there are still battles being waged when we think about Nicaragua, when we think about El Salvador, when we think about the world continues to Brazil and different parts of South America. There continues to be unrest and upheaval where indigenous people are arguing for the right for what? Political self-determination and liberation and freedom. So Malcolm's always on that side. I do think what we'll see where they really converge by 1964 is that Malcolm, he takes his Hajj to Mecca. And remember, Malcolm is a part of this global Islamic community, right? Malcolm was always a Muslim, whether he's in the Nation of Islam or he takes the Hajj. But he starts to say that sincere whites can be part of the movement, right? If whites are willing to give up white privilege and racism, they can be part of this movement, which he calls a global human rights movement. And he also says this at Oxford University, David, in 1964, one of the best debates. And the BBC carries this debate where Malcolm receives a standing ovation. He does a 30-minute debate. And he's actually, this is an interesting historical nugget. He's actually defending Barry Goldwater's phrase, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, but for different ideological reasons than Barry Goldwater.
Right.
Barry Goldwater is a conservative hero of the American right, and he used that term to defend racial segregation. Malcolm used the term extremism in defense of liberty is no vice to defend his adage of by any means necessary, liberation by any means necessary, freedom, citizenship by any means necessary. And he tells the students, multiracial audience at Oxford University, he says that he's willing to align with any person, no matter what the color of their skin, as long as they want to end the miserable condition on the face of this earth. And I always found those words very, very profound for Malcolm, because you can see just the evolution. You see the evolution. With King becomes this man on fire the last 3 years of his life. I mean, he's an anti-imperialist. He's a radical. He becomes a revolutionary where he breaks with the Johnson administration. The Riverside Church speech, April 4th, 1967 in New York. King says that the United States of America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And he says there comes a time when silence is betrayal, David. And he says that it's going to be a bitter but beautiful struggle. And he criticizes the United States. He says, people told me to be nonviolent in Selma. And when I say be nonviolent in Hanoi, and they're bombing and they're putting napalm on children, they say that I'm anti-American. So he tells us that the three biggest evils facing humanity are militarism, racism, and materialism. So King is this extraordinary figure. And King by 67 is always also saying that rioting is the language of the unheard, of the oppressed. So everybody who's saying that right now, Dr. King would be anti-BLM or anti these protests, they have it exactly wrong. Dr. King said the roots of unrest and chaos in the United States were based on white supremacy and poverty. He says it to the Kerner Commission in October of 1967. He says it during a Southern Christian Leadership Conference keynote speech where he says the halls of the U.S. Congress are running wild with racism. He says it before a speech to the American Psychological Association where he says the biggest threat to American democracy is white violence and white chaos. And white people are hypocritically saying that if there was peace, there could be racial progress, but they are the origins of the chaos in Watts, in Detroit, everywhere, in terms of police brutality, poverty, racial segregation. So when we think about King, King is not this milquetoast nice guy who's giving people hugs. He's a nonviolent revolutionary. And we stop King, our memory, national memory of him, it stops with Selma, or sometimes stops in 63 with the March on Washington, because we don't want to face the revolutionary King.
So clearly, some of the stories that we are told about both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King are certainly oversimplified and maybe one note when the reality is more complicated. I want to go back to something you said. You talked about the sort of guidelines that Malcolm X expressed about in what way can white folks credibly be part of the movement. And I'm really interested in that because the general question I want to ask you is, what do you believe the views of these two men would be about modern identity politics? And
Yeah.
the view I've expressed before is that on the one hand, using identity as either a cudgel or a way to silence people, I think is a disaster. An example that I've pointed out was the way in which the Women's March leadership kept out Jewish women because they were not intersectional enough in the right way. I'm very much against that. On the other hand, our identity informs our experience, and of course we should be paying particular attention to what one's experience has to say about solving a particular problem. And I think that that's where the right goes wrong in this kind of umbrella denunciation of identity as even something relevant to talk about. So all of that being said, how would these two men, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, view what in today's language is called identity politics?
Yeah, I think that they would be supportive, but they would want nuance to it, right? So Malcolm, Martin, people like James Baldwin. And here's where, I probably would say, when we think about identity politics, David, historically, there's always been identity politics in the United States. It's just that they were based on cisgender, white, male WASPs who were very, very rich.
Which, by the way, still exists in some movements on the American right, like the Tea Party movement and others.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So these things in a de facto way, and sometimes in a very vicious way, were anti-Semitic, anti-Black, anti-woman, anti-people of color, anti-folks who are non-cisgender, who are LGBTQIA. So we have to say that. And what we did with that original identity politics, David, is that we said that was universal. That was the universality. That identity, whether it's Washington or Jefferson, was the key to the world to unlock human potential. And that's why when we would read Faulkner or Walt Whitman, you think Shakespeare. You're not necessarily even reading stuff by white women when you thought what the classics were, right? You're not reading stuff by Jews. You're not reading stuff by Muslims. You're not reading stuff by Black people. So we have to say the original identity politics has everything to do with race, but it's a white supremacist, very elitist, classist, heteronormative identity politics. What then Black people and other people of color, indigenous people, and sometimes we say BIPOC, Black, indigenous people of color. What BIPOC groups have done, really starting with Black, really women, Black feminists, going back to the 19th century, was this idea of intersectionality. Now, there's always been intersectional issues in the Black community, but Black feminists have led the way in intersectionality. And what they mean by that is it's not just race, class, gender, sexuality, gender identification, non-binary. It's not just that. It's saying, how do we live our lives? How do we live our identities? And it is connected to class. It's connected to race. It's connected to gender. It's connected to whether we're able-bodied or not. And they made the argument that the only way you can understand communities and this idea of looking for social justice was by looking at what people's specific points of view were based on the way in which their identities were considered by institutions, right? And by structures. So when we think about the COVID-19 pandemic, it has affected all of us. And I've been preaching this. And then my caveat is ... differently. It has affected all of us differently. Some of us can Skype, and I have a kindergartner who's Skyping and going to school. I'm a professor. I'm very, very blessed. I've been able to continue teaching financially. I have not suffered. I've been able to help other people. I'm hugely blessed. I know of people who have lost everything because of COVID-19. Of course, there are the over 200,000 and around the world, way more than 1 million who've died. So that shows us how, and some people, and we've seen the data, some billionaires have made tens of billions during this COVID pandemic, while other people have lost jobs. So when we think about identity politics, I think it's important for us to understand is that the original identity politics disallowed any of us from connecting to that identity on an equal basis. And what now people are trying to do is say, if we look at identity in an intersectional way, we actually can find universality in that, you know? And so I think King would push us in this sense. King becomes very much interested in Black consciousness, but not some kind of mystical racial consciousness. He's inviting us all to be part of what he calls the world house, multiracial, multi-generational, even multi-ideological. That world, Jews, Palestinians, right? Muslims, Christians, seek to create a beloved community that's based on an ethic of care and an honest evaluation of that entire society, right? So that's what I think when you think about King. Malcolm, here's what I'll say about Malcolm. Malcolm's going to even complicate identity politics even more, because Malcolm's making an argument that sincere whites can be part of the solution, but he also is saying that he wants to be part of this both secular but global Islamic world that is pushing for human rights, not violence, human rights for all people, right? And so when we think about their understanding of identity politics, I think their understanding is rooted in a universalism that you get to the universalism through the particular experiences of Black and other people of color. And certainly Malcolm racialized white people from the jump. He understood that whiteness was also a social construction alongside of Blackness. So I don't think that they would be utilizing identity politics in any way to prevent people from coming together and building coalitions and alliances, but they'd want those alliances to be based on equal power relations and then just honesty about the pitfalls of American exceptionalism, an honesty about what is real racial progress and have we achieved it, just an honesty about the issues that we're all facing.
What's really interesting about that, I've never used this term in the context of talking about identity politics, but what you're talking about is a sort of non-reductionist consideration of identity, where we're saying, well, this is a piece. One's identity is a piece, and that includes all of the characteristics you mentioned, as well as how those characteristics relate to institutions and government in the world. But maybe that's actually a relevant term, where what identity politics can become counterproductive when it's approached in a reductionist way.
Yeah, we can't reduce, and we're against essentialism. We're against reductionism. Identity politics is really about expanding who is part of the human family. And that's why, one of the best things about the BLM movement, and you saw the Black Trans Lives rallies in Brooklyn, is this idea of centering Black queer folks and Black poor folks and Black women, right? So that's the opposite of reduction. That's saying, hey, even Black people have at times fallen prey to patriarchy, to a kind of predatory capitalism, to imperialism, to anti-immigration, to homophobia. Black people have suffered through all these things that the society suffers from. So if we're a racist society, anti-Semitic society, anti-immigrant society, misogynistic society, it doesn't mean that certain communities escape all those structures. No, all communities imbibe those to a certain degree. And so what I think BLM at its best does is invite us all in and to reject the aspects of ourselves that are fall prey to any kind of bias or reductionism or essentialism, or what Dr. King called enemyism. He said we can't have enemy politics. He said we can't. You might have people who you disagree with who are opponents, but not enemies.
The last thing I want to talk about, and you sort of alluded to a little bit of this, is your thoughts on the way in which some on the American right, particularly over the last 6 months, but really the last 5 years, 8 years, you've seen it maybe even longer, have tried to sort of claim Martin Luther King. And sometimes it's very offhanded statements, as you mentioned, like Martin Luther King would be against Black Lives Matter, which you've addressed a little bit. But even bigger picture, Martin Luther King would be for right-wing economics as we understand them today, or, all of these other ideas. It strikes me as inaccurate, but I want to hear your take on that.
Yeah, no, it's highly inaccurate. Martin Luther King Jr. was a human rights activist. He was a believer in democracy, but social democracy, when we think about a large safety net for all of us. Martin Luther King Jr. was anti-violence and certainly anti-predatory capitalism. Predatory, let's say it. There's a predatory capitalism where even those who are capitalists and are wealthy, like Warren Buffett, say this has gone too far. This has gone too far, and this is going to actually lead to the destruction of the society. That's how far it's gone. So when we think about Dr. King, I think, if anything, Dr. King challenges us. He challenges myths of American exceptionalism. He challenges the willful deployment of violence at the state level, at the international and global level. And he really challenges all of us, David, to, again, build that beloved community based on shared sacrifice. What is the beloved community? And I can break it down. He says that community is one that's free of racial injustice, free of economic impoverishment, and also free of political violence and overt materialism. Because he says all these things are things that don't bring us together. They're divisive, right? And so when we think about King, King is really an extraordinary figure. The Poor People's Campaign is what I'd like to really focus on. He's getting African Americans, Latinx, he's getting indigenous Native Americans, poor whites from Appalachia and the Missouri Ozarks, all together to go down to Washington, D.C. and do this. Again, this is different from Occupy Wall Street. This is an explicitly multiracial movement, explicitly, because he's saying the only way we can transform the society, yes, we're going to resist anti-Black racism, but there's all these other people suffering, and we have to find our suffering and our empathy within each other. So we can see he's really not somebody who's can be, even if people try, but utilized as a figure who was a defender of the status quo. He's a figure who wants more freedom, more democracy, and more really human empathy. The idea of love, and Cornel West always says this, love is what justice looks like in public, right? This is what King is advocating.
What, I guess if you push me, what I could say maybe would have a shade of something that we would recognize in the modern American right would be a bit of a libertarian streak when it comes to non-aggression principle and I mean, but again, that's if you push me and say, can you identify anything that might match up with the modern American right? But even that feels like a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I think that, his non-aggression policies, I mean, there's some people who are libertarians who feel that way, but this idea of human rights guiding foreign policy,
right,
and guiding our foreign policy in ways that we set a shining example as liberty's surest guardian, not because of the number of missiles we have, but because of what he called our moral position in the world. And
that's different.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really different. That's some people might say it's soft and fuzzy. I think it's aspirational. And remember, King said that he's a pacifist, but he agreed with the use of force during World War II because of the genocide of 6 million Jews. So so King is an extraordinary figure who's also a pragmatic figure. So if there's that kind of existential threat, of course we should take arms. Of course we should take arms to liberate people and to really prevent that from ever happening in global history again.
We've been speaking with Dr. Peniel Joseph, who is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, also teaches history at the University of Texas, Austin. The book is The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Such a pleasure speaking with you today.
Hey, thank you, David. I enjoyed our conversation.